Josephine Earp emerged on the Old West scene late, when railroad expansion and the Silver Rush were reshaping territories such as Arizona and Nevada. After leaving the Jewish community of Brooklyn, she settled in San Francisco and, at 18, joined traveling theater troupes. Once in Tombstone, she crossed paths with Wyatt Earp and witnessed the events that culminated in the famed gunfight at the OK Corral. In the final phase of the Apache Wars, Geronimo's camp became a stage of tension. The Chiricahua chief, famous for raids in Arizona and Mexico, was captured after a long pursuit and brought before General George Crook, leader of the Southwest Campaign. On March 30, 1886, at Canon de los Embudos, Geronimo escaped with only a few followers, prolonging indigenous resistance to the U.S. for months. Around 1881, during the height of the Silver Rush that turned Tombstone into a commercial hub of the Arizona Territory, Samantha Fallon established herself as a central figure in local urban life. She ran the San Jose House Hotel, a lodging point for travelers and merchants, and maintained an elegant millinery on Fremont Street, meeting the demands of wealthy miners and their families. In Tombstone, Arizona, amid the fervor of the 1880s, the struggle over grazing lands and cattle routes shaped border life. In that setting arose Wake Benj, Tad Rowland, and Jeff Lewis, cowboys whose fame was forged in roundups and saloon gunfights on Fremont Street, where their feats defended herds and inspired ballads that still echo today. On the 1880s frontier, John Slaughter, a rancher and former Tombstone sheriff during the Silver Rush, pursued an Apache group that had retreated north into Mexico after clashes with U.S. troops. During the escape, a young girl was left behind, Apache May. Isolated after her parents withdrew under fire, she was found by Slaughter, who took her to the ranch to be raised among settlers. George Whitwell Parsons, who arrived in Tombstone in 1879 at the height of the Silver Rush, began meticulously recording daily life in the frontier community. Shootouts on Fremont Street, political clashes in the Oriental Saloon, miners' pilgrimages to the local courthouse, and the unrest that preceded the gunfight at the OK Corral. His diary became a primary source for understanding everyday life and tensions in the Old West. An 1881 image shows, from left to right, Tom McClory, Frank McClory, and Billy Clanton, rivals of the Earp brothers in Tombstone, Arizona. Shortly after, on October 26th of that year, the trio would fall in the famous confrontation beside the OK Corral, a bloody milestone in westward expansion. This copy, preserved in Arizona archives, is the only one known of Billy. An image captured on March 27, 1886, in Canon de los Embudos, Arizona, depicts Geronimo flanked by Chiricahua warriors and officers of General George Crook. The encounter took place in the dying days of the Apache Wars, when, after years of skirmishes and escapes, the chief negotiated surrender under military pressure and encirclement of tribal lands, seeking to ensure his people's survival. Taken during an assembly in the late 19th century, the scene shows Lakota leaders seated opposite federal representatives at a Plains fort. After decades of conflict over land and hunting routes, they were negotiating a treaty aimed at ending hostilities, defining tribal boundaries, and paving the way for future diplomatic talks between the two nations. The scene, likely captured in the late 19th century, shows young Chiricahua Apaches, mostly boys, lined up in front of a wickiup of branches and pelts, a typical dwelling of families on the plains of Arizona and New Mexico. Their serious stance reflects the period of military vigilance that followed the Apache Wars. Around them, the rocky ridge and the vast sky underscore the harshness of their ancestral territory. Shot in March 1886 at Canon de los Embudos, Sierra Madre, the scene gathers 16 Chiricahua Apaches during the surrender talks between Geronimo and General Crook. The mounted men stand at the back. In front, women and children maintain a firm posture. C.S. Fly's lens immortalizes the group at a key moment in the Apache Wars, when the nation fought to preserve its land. In 1886, after years of Apache resistance to U.S. forces, Geronimo agreed to pose alongside Natchez, his longtime ally, and Cisna, then a teenager. The photograph was taken at Fort Bowie, Arizona, during negotiations preceding exile to Florida, at Geronimo's express request, a gesture that underscores his desire to preserve the memory of his family and of the conflict. Geronimo appears already mature, a symbol of persistent Apache defense at the close of the 19th century. After the Treaty of Guadalupe, Hidalgo opened vast lands to American expansion. He led Chiricahua groups on raids across Arizona, New Mexico, and Sonora, facing U.S. and Mexican forces until surrendering in 1886, after which he was sent to Fort Bowie and later to Oklahoma. Around 1900, in the Orient Saloon of Bisbee, Arizona, miners, gunmen, and travelers squeezed around the table to play a fast-paced game of faro. In these frontier towns, fueled by the copper boom, saloons served as centers of business, music, and drink. The quick rounds, decided by the order of the cards, promised instant winnings and kept the excitement going until dawn. At the top of a barren hill, Boot Hill Cemetery holds the remains of pioneers, gunmen, and miners who populated Tombstone during the Silver Boom, from 1879 to the mid-1880s. Here lie figures connected to the famed gunfight at the OK Corral, and to the battles over mining claims that marked the Arizona Territory's expansion toward statehood. In 1886, in a setting marked by railroad expansion and the end of the Apache Wars, Chiricahua prisoners paused by the Southern Pacific tracks on the banks of the Nueces River. Guarded by U.S. soldiers, they await transfer to Fort Marion, the post-surrender stage for Geronimo. The moment captures the encounter between Southwestern modernization and the last indigenous resistance. In August 1872, photographers captured the first house erected where Dodge City, Kansas would emerge. The wooden shelter, assembled by pioneers, reveals their effort to establish a presence along the cattle routes on the banks of the Arkansas River. At that moment, the Santa Fe Railroad was advancing, drawing merchants, hunters, and soldiers. The structure became a landmark marking the beginning of urbanization on the Great Plains. In 1889, during the consolidation of the western frontier after the gold rush and the railroad's advance, the bar of the Table Bluff Hotel in Humboldt County displays its lively interior. Oil lamps hang over shelves of bottles. Locally sawn wood covers the walls and counter, while travelers, lumberjacks, and farmers share news and seal deals over beer. The Anadarko town site arose in 1901, when the United States government opened lands formerly reserved for indigenous nations to settlement. The scene shows the first urban auction. On the sawmill platform, lots are called out to settlers, merchants, and speculators. That moment inaugurated the street grid, the arrival of the railroad, and the formation of an agricultural hub in southwestern Oklahoma. The 1898 scene shows workers driving railroad ties and laying rails in the heart of the Arizona desert, during the railroad expansion that followed the collapse of silver and the copper rush. The line aimed to connect local mines to Pacific ports and eastern markets, reducing transportation costs and accelerating the settlement of the territory, which was becoming a key piece of the American West. The 1886 image shows a family in Loup Valley, Nebraska, beside the covered wagon that served as their mobile home during the Great Migration West. Under wide-brimmed hats and thick coats to withstand the sun and wind of the prairies, they symbolize thousands of settlers driven by the Homestead Act of 1862 and railroad expansion, which offered cheap land and a new life on the plains. Scorched by the 1909 sun, an expedition led by Anglo-Americans advances on horseback across the arid slopes of Navajo Mountain, part of the Four Corners region. They seek Rainbow Bridge, a natural arch revered by the Dine since time immemorial, amid the federal mapping fever that in the early 20th century transformed the Southwest's cultural and geographic frontiers. In 1885, at the height of the Apache Wars, 11-year-old Jimmy McKinn appears among Chiricahua warriors alongside Geronimo. Captured in New Mexico in September, he spent months in the nomadic desert camps, learning language and customs. When U.S. troops secured Geronimo's surrender in Skeleton Canyon in 1886, the boy resisted leaving the group he already called family. On the Montana Plains, a late 19th century scene, cowboys carry out calf branding work, a vital practice to assert ownership under the open-range system established after the railroads arrived. With wide-brimmed hats, boots, and flannel shirts, they take on precise roles, restraining the young animal while the heated iron serves as the ranch's signature. In 1878, in the Dodge City, Kansas rail yard, imposing piles of about 40,000 buffalo hides reveal the height of the slaughter that nearly exterminated the bison of the Great Plains. Railroads linked hunters to industrial leather markets, and the extermination driven by military and civilian procurement contracts reshaped the frontier economy and devastated indigenous cultures dependent on the animal. On September 14, 1904, veteran train robber John Sontag lies on the ground after a shootout with marshals in California. Even wounded, he breathes, surrounded by residents eager to witness the end of a cycle of violence that had marked the American interior since the 1880s railroad expansion, when he and Chris Evans challenged the Southern Pacific. The 1876 photograph shows Deadwood, then in the Dakota Territory, at the height of the Black Hills Gold Rush. Tents and plank buildings line the muddy street, revealing a settlement hastily erected to accommodate miners, merchants, and gamblers seeking fortune. The scene exposes the typical urban fragility of Western boomtowns. At the end of the 19th century, when Seattle was establishing itself as the gateway for adventurers to the Klondike dance hall and saloon became a central point of urban life. There, by kerosene light, prospectors, sailors, and residents gathered in search of music, dancing, and drink, reflecting the economic drive of the gold rush and the rapid growth of the port city. Corinne, Utah, 1869. On the newly completed Transcontinental route, this street reveals the effervescence of frontier towns in the post-Civil War era. Wooden shops line the dust, serving travelers, railroad workers, and both Mormon and Gentile merchants. The straight facades illustrate the rush to erect infrastructure in the face of rapid westward expansion. They announce future supply depots. In 1907, on the outskirts of Washington, a photograph shows a scene of rural daily life. 7 children perched on the back of a cow that serves in place of an absent wagon. In the early 20th century, farming communities improvised transportation to school, revealing road deficiencies and the importance placed on children's education even in subsistence areas. In 1895, in what was then the Oklahoma Territory, the scene shows the schoolteacher surrounded by children in front of the wooden schoolhouse built by settlers after the 1893 land run. These one-room units maintained by the community symbolized the push for literacy on agricultural frontiers, where multi-grade classes shared scarce books and the academic calendar followed the harvest cycle. In 1871, amid the railroad expansion that was redesigning Arizona, correspondent Fred Loring poses next to his mule, ready to report on caravan traffic and clashes on the post-Civil War frontier. The scene displays calm before the danger. 2 days later, on the trail near Wickenburg, Loring fell in an Apache ambush, a symbol of the tensions between travelers and native peoples in the Southwest. California, 1889. On the edge of the Pacific at Point San Pedro, Chinese fishermen erect a modest village of cabins and reeds, linking nets to salt pans and clay stoves. These migrants, heirs to the waves that arrived during the gold rush and the building of the Central Pacific, defy exclusion laws and inhospitable tides to put down roots on the western frontier. In 1892, on the arid plateaus of the Shoshone Reservation in the western United States, The community gathered for the annual dance that preserved strands of their heritage predating railroad expansion and settler advance. To the sound of drums, elders recounted ancestral deeds. Youth displayed steps that united generations, and women offered corn kernels to the fire, a symbol of collective continuity. Arizona, 1893. On arid lands near the reservations, Apache warriors and families carry bundles of hay to Anglo-American settlers' wagons. The gesture reflects the delicate exchange network on the Old West frontier, while indigenous peoples sought to maintain autonomy after the Apache Wars. Ranchers depended on that forage for the livestock brought by the new railroads. In 1900 in Langtree, a small community on the banks of the Big River, Judge Roy Bean's courthouse saloon concentrated local civil services and the town's social life. Self-proclaimed the law west of the Pecos, Bean tried cases, sold liquor, and announced sentences at the same counter, illustrating the improvised justice that marked Western expansion after the American Civil War.